Hi, I'm Valerie Engelhart. I am a watercolor artist, and today I want to show you how I created this spooky skulls in trees painting. And as you can see in the upper left corner, I already did a study just to test out what colors and mediums that I wanted to use. So obviously I'm getting right into it. What I've done is used Daniel Smith Lunar Red Rock and straight from the tube just squeezed some of it onto my paper. I'm using Arches rough press, 140 pounds, 12 by 16 inches. And I just put the paint up in the corner and was using my brush to bring that paint down. Right now I am splattering on some granulation medium, hoping to get some cool granulation effects. Um, and then using a sprayer bottle to get that paint moving. The Lunar Red Rock is a fairly heavy paint, so it does need a little more encouragement to flow. And I decided to go again, adding a little more splatter. You get kind of different effects if you let the paint dry a little bit before you add the granulation medium. Now I'm moving on to my Dr. PH Martin Hydrus liquid watercolor paint, and I am squeezing burnt sienna straight from the pipette, and I'm using the little tincture to draw some of the branches. And because I know that I want some of them to be thicker, I'm using my brush as well. So a mix of using my brush and the tincture to create these like broken, barren branches. And I'm just going pretty randomly. I just know that I want them to sort of radiate in a specific direction. But I don't want to be too precious about this because it's watercolor. It's kind of going to do a bit of what it wants anyway, and that's the joy of it. Now I'm going in one color darker, and there's my daughter poking her head in. She loves to help me out. Um, Going in a little darker now, using some of the Hydrus burnt umber. And the reason I have my paper at that angle is I want the water and the paint to flow in a particular direction. I want to create movement because later I am going to switch the paper around. The top is going to be the bottom. Now I'm just encouraging some of that pigment to flow. You can probably see some beads building up, and I'm encouraging them to move in the direction I want. And I'm just loving some of these textures, just letting paint dry naturally, letting the water flow through it. It's just magical. I love watercolor. All right, now that that layer has dried, I am going into some Daniel Smith watercolor ground in buff titanium. In that upper left-hand corner, you can see my study, and I've got two skulls. One, I tried using some white ink. I thought that was a little too cool of a color, a little too white, but the buff titanium, with its warm tones, complemented the warm, earthy colors nicely. And I chose watercolor ground over watercolor because watercolor is transparent. The watercolor ground uh, is fairly opaque, but normally you have to use many layers when you use it to prep a surface. So I'm not really using it for its intended purpose. I'm using it almost like a gouache. The only difference is when it dries, it's dry, it won't reactivate. Made a little splotch there, so I'm going to keep carving my skull almost to get my shapes. Just sculpting what I see and what I imagine the planes of the face to look like. adding some more to the back of the cranium. And using a palette knife to scrape some of that extra watercolor ground that I kind of splotched onto the paper. And I'm just rubbing in it a bit. It's probably going to be covered later anyway, so I'm not too concerned. And I love that when you apply this thinly, that underlayer shows through and that creates instant depth and shadow. And I don't plan my paintings too far in advance. I kind of know the feeling of what I want to do, but because the background's spontaneous, I can't really place my elements until my background is dry and I can analyze it. So you'll often see me measure things out with my brush or my hand, trying to decide where to lay elements that complement the painting nicely. So here I'm adding another skull, but this one's going to be looking to the side. Now, compared to some of the other videos I have where there are animals and flowers and bright colors, what prompted me to do this creepy skull painting? And the answer is a local gallery is looking for fall art. And I don't have any fall art right now, but they did say that Halloween was a subject they would consider. And I thought, oh, great, I can do something spooky for Halloween. So this is a little different for me, but I'm really digging it. I have found that my two skulls are missing their jawbone. And so out on a branch, I am painting a human jaw. And I know what that looks like without picking up a reference photo because I've studied for art purposes what the bone structure looks like for the human jaw. So I kind of already have that memorized. And all I'm doing right now is deciding where do I put my next one, and I decide right there. It's almost like Bob Ross when he's picking out where his happy trees go, just sort of looks at his scenery and goes, we need a happy tree right there. Well, right now, I need the tortured soul of the damned right there, right in that spot. And it's usually good to work in odd numbers. And so I have nothing going on in this lower segment. So I'm going to put a skull here, but it's going to be the least important skull. And so I'm putting it in really lightly. And honestly, at this point in the painting, I'm still kind of unsure about it. So I make it nice and light. So if I decide I don't want it later, I can easily paint over it and it won't be too distracting. I don't want it sticking out too much, so I do blend some of that watercolor ground into the background. Okay, moving on now, I'm adding more of that burnt umber, very concentrated, a dark value to create shadows where like the nose hole and the eye holes are. Because it's looking okay, but it is pretty flat right now. We only have a mid-tone really and a light tone. So now I'm starting to add darker tones onto the skulls to bring more attention to them as these are the subjects of the painting. And this one in particular is going to be the main one, so it's going to get the most detail and attention. And honestly, I still have some wet paint in some places on my painting. So I'm just dipping my brush into those wet droplets to paint elsewhere. Put in the gaps between the teeth, and now I'm hollowing out the cheekbone area. adding a little shadow to the top to make the brow more prominent. And then I also glaze over the teeth slightly because as they're set in the skull, they are a little further back than that, well, the bone that's on top. So I want to show that they're a little further back in the field of vision. And I'm just going to do that to all of the skulls. Just darken the eye sockets, darken the nose hole. If there are teeth, you don't want to add lines. You want to add just like little triangles, little hints that there are the spaces in between the teeth. If you add lines, well, it looks cartoonish and also looks like teeth are missing. But if you don't do it correctly, it doesn't look anatomically correct. So that would be my big tip for teeth, is where the teeth connect to where the gums, or in this case, where that bone is of the rest of the face, just add little dots or little triangles to separate the teeth. Just grabbing more of that paint that's already on my paper right now. And as you can see, I bring my tiny little brush and I'm just making little dots to show where the separation of the teeth are. Because at a distance, you're really not going to see every individual tooth. Adding a little more shadow. Now I'm darkening that little skull at the bottom that I wasn't sure I was going to keep. Well, at this point, I've decided it's going to stay, but it is the least important out of all of the skulls, so it is going to have the least amount of detail and depth. All right, working on my jaw now. And I'm doing that same thing. Grab a little bit of paint from elsewhere on my paper and adding shadows. Now, one thing I am noticing as I paint this, that the jaw is blending in too much with the background. So I am adding darker values, trying to paint around it to have it pop off the page a bit. And I work on that later when I add the dark branches, which I'm doing now. So I pick up, oh, I think I went ahead and got into sepia for this one. So this would be the Dr. P.H. Martin Hydrus sepia paint. And I am drawing in the branches, and I want these to be jagged and rough and organic. So I draw with the tincture in these jerky motions and then pull out my palette knife to drag the paint, and it creates these lovely dry marks and these like crackled branches. Like, these really do look like something from one of my favorite poems, The Hollow Men. Just the idea of this wasteland, this barren land. And it's important that my shapes connect. And I do have a branch go in front of that one skull because I do want, more depth, dimension, and show where these things sort of sit in this tree. And don't be afraid to cover up some of what you did before because it will make the painting better. Adding the depth creates far more interest. Because if every one of my skulls just sat on top and in front of the tree, it would look boring. So go ahead and just paint, draw over what you've already done. It might seem a little scary going in so dark, but it is worth it. And one thing that watercolor artists, especially beginners, usually struggle with is going in dark. Uh, so I encourage you to do it for two reasons. One, it's just great fun. It really does help the light things pop off the page. But watercolor dries paler. In this case, I am going in with like the pure liquid paint. So this one doesn't dry paler. Um, but for the most part, when you use watercolor, it dries quite a bit paler than what you put it down. So always go darker, it will lighten up. I guess I shouldn't say always, but I confidently say 9 times out of 10. And I am just having a blast moving this pigment around with my palette knife. If you haven't used a palette knife while painting in watercolor, I encourage it. It is a great way to get straight lines, some really dry texture, and it helps that I'm using rough press paper. So whenever my palette knife glides over the paper, it kind of skips in spots because the tooth of the paper is, well, rough. It's very bumpy. So for any paintings where you want a lot of texture or really earthy looks, I recommend going rough press. Right over there, I have a branch coming through the skull's eye socket. I thought it was a nice touch. Again, as a way to add more interest and depth. And then I realize, oh, I need a branch down here. And so I'm putting one in. And you see, I do have to dip my palette knife into the water because it is watercolor. It does need water to move. So this is a very thick application, and it works well because it's already in liquid form. It does get a little harder to do if you have to dilute the paint. And now I'm just letting the palette knife dance around, just wherever I intuitively think there needs to be something here, I scratch something in. Gone back to the tincture and putting in another branch. Now that I've got my darkest value in, I realize I need to go even darker on these eye sockets. And that's another bonus to going really dark. Obviously not too early in your painting, but if you wait until the very end, then you can realize that your values are all completely off. And so it's good to do a value check as you go. I applied the darkest part of my painting and realized, oh, my focal point needs to have more contrast. And so I'm adding that now. And the lovely thing is, if I go too dark, if I make a mistake, I can let it dry and go over it again with some of that buff titanium. Luckily, I didn't have to do it this time, but just keep in mind that that is an option for you. I'm going in and painting a little more dark under that jawbone because I still feel like it needs to be brought out a little more, have a little more attention to it. All right, now that that dark value is dry, I've used my palette knife to scoop out some more Daniel Smith iridescent gold watercolor ground. So I've chosen watercolor ground because I like that it gives a bit of a raised texture and it's fairly opaque. And so because this is the most important skull in my composition and my focal point, it's getting this golden crown. And one way to show off your lovely dark colors is to add some light. So I'm going through, and I don't want to do it everywhere, but I do want to add some of this gold onto the branches to show reflections of light, to give it more of a texture. Texture is something I really like in my paintings. again, I'm not being too careful or precious about it. I'm just going in and intuitively thinking, okay, let's break up this dark mass. Let's slap on a little bit of the gold and then dragging it to create texture. And having this rough paper really helps to create that texture. And it's amazing how much adding that gold helps that sepia color pop. And another reason why I would encourage you to, when you go with your dark value, go really dark, because when you do have it next to something light, that contrast is striking. It's visually appealing. And really, at the end, it's just fun to play with. I love adding gold to paintings. Just having a little bit of sparkle, bling up my little baddies. At one point, I wanted to add a spider web with a spider in it, but I got kind of lazy and I felt it would be too much, which is another great lesson, is knowing when to stop or when you've done enough. So I could have added the spider web and spider and it would have looked fine, would have looked great, but I might have taken the attention away from what I was trying to convey. Um, and I might not have taken it away very much, and who knows, maybe it would have been better. But usually, a lot of artists say to stop before you think you need to, and it keeps you from going too far, from overworking your painting, especially when you get into a groove because you just are having so much fun placing things down that you don't realize that you've gone too far. So in those cases, I highly encourage taking a step back, maybe go paint a colorful wash on another piece of paper, but give yourself a break before coming back. Oh, and now I've decided it's done and I'm going to sign it using the ground. So thanks for joining me with this painting. I hope you enjoyed it. It was so much fun. And if you have any questions, let me know. Have a great day. Bye.